Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Now in this video I am going to revisit the game which I reviewed some time ago from the World at War series. It's a magazine game and I speak of course of Pacific Battles Malaya. Now I gave this game a rather negative review in the end and I stand by the conclusions that I came to. As produced and published, this game unfortunately has a lot of issues. And despite the fact that it has lovely production quality and, as I said in my previous videos, wonderful, counters, units, the components are pretty great. Unfortunately, the game had some rather major problems, I feel, that may not have prevented it from being a good game per se, but made it an absolutely terrible representation of the campaign for Malaya and Singapore between December 1941 and February 1942. Now, recently, I had a chance to spend a weekend at a friend's house, and he and I are quite keen to make this game work. So we intensively played a number of times, swapping sides, trying new rules, trying to make it more historical. And I think we've succeeded to a degree. If there's anyone out there who has this game and is struggling with it as we are, there is hope. I'm going to say that right from the start. There are ways of improving it and making it a pretty good simulation. Now, as I speak and record this, what we've been doing is still very much a work in progress. We are going to carry on working on this game, but I can share with you some of the early conclusions we have come to and which we have found very, very helpful. Now, the very first one of these is we are going to eliminate, and strongly recommend you do so too, the mandatory attack rule from the standard rules. As written, and I'm going to give you an example of what I mean if you've not seen any of the previous videos on this game. Let us say, for example, I'm just going to zoom in, that a British unit is occupying this bit of mountainous terrain, basically blocking one of the southward roads. Under the mandatory attack rule, if you begin your turn within the zone of control of an enemy unit, you must attack that unit. Weird. Now, the mountains are a strong defensive position, and that British unit is in a very good position, relatively speaking. However, understandably, in this scenario, in the Malaya campaign scenario, Commonwealth units, which are not jungle trained, do not exert zones of control into the jungle. Now, what does this mean practically? A Japanese unit wanting to eliminate or turf out that Commonwealth unit simply needs to enter that jungle hex, which is itself very strong defensive terrain, and wait. And at the start of the Commonwealth player's next turn, because of the mandatory attack rule, they are compelled to assault that position. Ridiculous rule, utterly ridiculous, and it exposes the game to severe, rules lawyery, gamey moves that are totally ahistorical. Discard it, don't use it. There is no such thing in the way we're now playing this game as the mandatory attack rule. That is gone. The second improvement we feel we've made is that we've cleaned up the supply rules. Now, again, in the rules as written, both the Commonwealth and the Japanese seem to benefit from seemingly limitless sea lift capacity. Supply routes by road seem to have very little significance in the campaign. It's completely feasible for British forces, let's say, for example, British forces are cut off and surrounded in Kuala Lumpur. As long as they have access to those ports, they can remain in supply. Now, that is odd, because historically the Commonwealth did not have the sea lift capacity to supply units exclusively by sea. Simply couldn't do it. Even the Japanese were dependent on road and rail-borne supplies to a large degree. They never shut down their supply line coming through Thailand. So none of these are reflected in the game, and it means that the Commonwealth disadvantage in terms of dependence on roads for supply is completely gone. So what have we done to fix this? We have done away with the rules as written in the rule book, and we have restored the notion of the necessity of keeping units in supply by road. So, for the Japanese, in our games, supply is now traced from the rail line running into Thailand, the ports of Singora and Patani, and any East Coast ports that the Japanese may seize that are starred, indicating major status. So that gives the Japanese an incentive to go for these, as well as the obvious gold stars that they can gain if they do so. For the Commonwealth, the supply source is ultimately Singapore. Commonwealth can draw supply from Kuala Lumpur as long as it's connected to Singapore, but those are the two main supply sources. The way we've played it now, you cannot rely as the Commonwealth player on any of these ports, because not only does Japanese air strength in theatre make it unlikely that you could supply your troops decently that way, again, the Commonwealth simply didn't have the available shipping to be able to feed and supply and arm such a large army so heavily by sea, let's put it that way. Another change we've made is in the use of supply counters. Now, normally in the game, these are on the map and they function almost as units in their own right, and they can be burnt to supply a nearby headquarters. We've done away with this system. The way we're playing it is that any headquarters or unit that has a line of supply that it can trace, it doesn't have to be on the road or rail line can be within its zone of control. If it can trace supply, it is in supply. And we are using these markers to track the overall supply level. So they're off map. We've done away with the fiddle of having them on map. So if you can trace supply, you are in supply, and supply is simply depleted from a centralized pile. Now, if aerial bombardment, artillery bombardment, or anything along those lines, any events that cause supply to be burnt are drawn, they are simply burnt from your off-map pile. In two of the games we trialed, this system worked very well and actually made the game run a lot more smoothly, so I strongly recommend adopting that one. Now, what happens if units are cut off out of supply? Because obviously this makes a major change. We're still working on tightening up the rules for that, but borrowing rules from games pertaining to the Burma campaign and other games on this particular subject, the fall of Singapore, we are saying that British or Japanese units that are out of supply have their defense and attack and movement factors halved. They're no longer able to attack either, but they still can exert a zone of control. Also, units that are out of supply must move within their turn as far as possible to place themselves back in supply. We did trial rules to do with gradual disappearance of units that are out of supply, so degradation to the point of disintegration, but the jury is still out on how well those would work, so we're going to leave that for now. So just as a reminder, the Japanese supply routes, anything that connects them to the rail line running towards Thailand, any East Coast ports with a star that they seize, with the exception of Patani, the original landing port. Singora and Patani are always supply points. For the British, ultimately Singapore, but also Kuala Lumpur if it's connected to Singapore. Another major criticism we had of this game was that the British were allowed a fair latitude for free deployment of units, but at the same time their hands were severely tied. The rules as written did not permit free deployment British units to be closer to Johor Bahru over here than they were to the Thai border. Now, this was utterly ridiculous because what it meant in practice was that the British were unable to begin the game garrisoning the southern half of Malaya. And a canny Japanese player, because working with the rules that made supply and being in supply utterly irrelevant, could conceivably land a force in southern Malaya and try to secure Singapore first, and then mop up the British in a northward move. Very, very, very odd. So what we have done instead is found that the game works an awful lot better if you go for the historical deployments. Now, luckily, the official US history of the war in the Pacific and the Far East includes not only excellent maps of the progress of the campaign, but also, I'm looking at the leftmost one here, the British forces' dispositions on 7th December 1941. You can find this work in print, you can find these maps online, it's very easy. I am actually typing up a unit deployment list with hex numbers, so if you want that list, please send me a message. I will type it up and I will share it. Historical deployments suddenly make this game make sense, not just as a game, but also as a teaching tool, because it helps you to understand why the British deployed as they did, what their strategic considerations were, and why the Japanese felt it was to their advantage to land where they did and commence the campaign from northern Malaya and then to move south. Now, you don't have to do this. You could actually allow free deployment for both sides, although to represent the Japanese advantage in intelligence and the information they gathered about British defences, I would recommend a system where the Commonwealth player sets up first and then the Japanese player decides on their invasion beaches. Obviously, use the supply rules with this, because otherwise you'll just end up in the situation the original game had, where units that are completely separate and but somehow completely in supply just wander up and down the map randomly fighting one another. One last suggestion to make this game playable, and that is changes to how the victory point track is used. Now, in the game, the victory point track is, unsurprisingly, a major determinant of how you win. We found, very oddly, that a lot of it was tied to how many units were slaughtered, and the Japanese could almost do better by killing off Commonwealth units rather than bothering to take Singapore. Oddly, in the first game I played with my opponent, the Japanese only made it down there, but they scored very high, a decisive victory on the victory point track. The last time I played the Japanese, through a huge amount of effort, I managed to get them into the outskirts of Singapore City with a ton of isolated and basically helpless Commonwealth units on the peninsula. The victory point count was so low, it was basically a draw. That made no sense to either of us. And so we've decided that the victory point track will continue to function in game, but only for the vital purpose of determining which side has initiative from turn to turn. My opponent came up with an excellent solution to this game's problem in terms of victory. For the Japanese, victory depends on taking Singapore. For the British, victory depends on holding Singapore. That is it. Anything else is a draw. If the Japanese are part way in, then it's a draw. Um, and it just gives both sides a clear objective to fight for and to defend. You don't have any of this mucking around counting up points anymore. Neither Percival nor Yamashita were terribly worried about that. And to be perfectly honest, while I appreciate the value of a victory point system, I feel it has been very badly handled in this game as it stands. So don't make the victory point track the be all or end all. It doesn't need to be for this to be a good game. So that's where we are so far. If you are, as I say, struggling with this game and trying to make it work, I would advise you to persevere. We did, and we found over the course of the weekend that there actually is a really good game hiding in here, and we will play it again. I'm going to continue to work with my friends to refine the game, to build up the improvements, and when we're happy with it, I am going to type them up properly and share them on Board Game Geek and any other forum where this game is represented. In the meantime, as I say, I hope these suggestions that we've trialed are useful to you. I do hope you carry on trying to play this game, and by all means, try all of what I've just described. I think you will find it rewards the effort, and it would be a shame to give up such a beautiful looking game for, you know, it has its problems, but we found they're not as unsolvable as I first thought. I have another personal reason for making this video, which is that those of you who've been through most of my channel will find that overall my reviews of the games I've looked at have been really positive. I've enjoyed the games. Some have had minor issues, but you know what? On the whole, they've been great. This game was the only one where my review was really quite negative, and that left a bit of a sour taste because I don't like being negative about things, and if I have to be, I'd like to combine the negativity with some solutions. So I hope this is of use. If you would like more detail on any of the points I've raised about this game, please do message me. I'll type you a response. Try and send you a copy of the rules, the adjustments that I've made once they're properly typed up. But in the meantime, I do hope that this will help make a rather bad game somewhat better. If it does, if it improves the gameplay for any of you out there, it will have been well worth it. Thank you very much for tuning in.